Welcome to A-Push. Today we're going to give you just the briefest overview of the Spanish colonial system. So, before we start, of course, here are our objectives today. Take a moment and process them. Pause the video if necessary. We'll be coming back to them at the end like we always do. So, let's talk about the Spanish colonial system. The Spanish colonies were created out of a series of treaties between Spain and Portugal, coupled with the sort of ad hoc system that was put together as the King and Queen of Spain, as we talked about last time, basically empowered young nobles without inheritance to go out and conquer things and then pay some tribute back to the crown. The first treaty you need to know is the Treaty of Alacovas, which gave Portugal control over more or less the entire African coast in response for recognizing Isabella as the Queen of Spain. This treaty paved the way for the much more important and influential Treaty of Tordesillas, which drew the lines between the Spanish and the Portuguese world in this treaty negotiated by the Pope. So the Treaty of Tordesillas, as we can see here, divided the world between the Spanish portion and the Portuguese portion. And the fact that the Pope felt like he could divide the world between Spain and Portugal tells you everything you need to know about how much the world is going to be changing very shortly. Not an overarching sense of geography. The line just happened to cut right through South America, giving Spain control over most of the American continents, whereas Portugal ostensibly got control over Africa, all of India, and China. But Portugal also got the coast of Brazil, which was very important in one of their routes navigating around the Cape of Good Hope here. So what's important, though, is that the vast majority of the Spanish mainland, or the vast majority of the American mainland, is controlled by Spain. The overarching economic theory that dominated this whole system was mercantilism, which again, hopefully you learned about in world history, so briefest of overviews. Mercantilist system, the whole thing is a closed circuit between a country and its colonies. The colonies produce raw materials, the home country manufactures those raw materials and sells the goods back to the colonies. This meant that Spain had no interest in having the colonies trade with each other. They simply wanted them to ship the raw materials back to Spain and then buy finished goods from Spain in order to profit the mother country. So the colonies existed as more or less a natural resource to provide for the wealth of the Spanish. So with that in mind, most of the Spanish Americas, and you can pause and take all this in if you need to, but most of the Spaniards in the Americas were engaged in agricultural products of one type or another. Some subsistence food, but of course it quickly switched to cash crops. But the main thing that made the Spanish so wealthy was they discovered a series of silver mines. There's one in Mexico, but the more famous one is Potosi in Bolivia. So all of this gave the Spanish a massive influx of silver, which made the Spanish incredibly rich for a time. And of course, they have to pay their royal fifth, so the more silver that is mined, the more silver that is shipped back to Spain for them to use. With this in mind, the Spanish colonial government was very, very, very decentralized. Process organized around the three principles of God, glory, and gold, as hopefully, again, you learned in world history. This meant, of course, that the Spanish could do more or less whatever they wanted as long as it followed within those objectives and the royal fifth kept flowing back to Spain. And so, of course, this led to massive mistreatment of Native Americans in order to ensure that they were extracting the maximum amount of wealth because the goal for every Spaniard was to get as rich as possible so they could go back to Spain and live in luxury. Very few Spaniards actually wanted to stay in the New World and make a life for any period of time, so they simply exploited all the resources they could in order to get the heck out of the Caribbean and get back to Spain. The actual organization of the empire was into these large viceroyalties, where a viceroy or under king ruled. And so you've got New Spain up in the north and also the Caribbean. You've got New Granada up here. You've got Peru along the coast, and then the Rio de la Plata in what is today Argentina. Each of these was, again, ruled very, very in a very decentralized fashion, with the viceroy having theoretical royal authority, but in reality, each Spaniard who owned an estate did more or less whatever they wanted. Eventually, the Spanish government did impose a racial-based caste system known as the casta, which again, hopefully you learned about in world history. with, white people on top and less white people below, and even less white people below them, as, most racial caste systems in Europe functioned this way. Obviously, there were a lot of mixed race people as well, because it was mostly men coming over who would often take native or African wives. And so all of these sort of all these sort of mixed groups, these mestizos, pardos, and other groups, fit somewhere within this caste system, somewhere in between the white people on top and the non-white people on the bottom. But this caste system was relatively fluid, and more pale-skinned mestizos could often pass as white, whereas less pale-skinned mestizos were often relegated to lower castes. And at the very end, part of the reforms of King Charles, there was an opportunity for non-white people to purchase legal writs of whiteness to allow them to move up into the Creole caste. But of course, they'd still face discrimination, and it was a very messy system that seems like there's a lot of rigid divides, but in reality, there's a lot of gray area in the middle where people actually operate. The economic system was organized around a principle called Comienda, in which a tract of land was given to a single Spaniard to set up his estate, and then he would have control over the estate and everyone living on the estate, including, of course, the Native Americans. The idea was that this decentralized system would allow the Spaniard to make a decent living, and at the same time, he'd be able to, quote unquote, civilize the natives by teaching them about real religion, aka Christianity, and by teaching them the value of hard work, by having them spend a portion of their time harvesting cash crops or mining silver or doing whatever profitable economic activity existed on the island. If you think the system actually worked that way, congratulations on being very optimistic, because man, it did not. In general, of course, the Spaniards had no interest in living in the Caribbean, and they worked the natives to death, usually or often, in order to extract as much wealth as possible, while doing very little, quote unquote, civilizing, assuming you even believe that that is a noble goal to be trying to achieve. So Encomienda quickly became incredibly brutal and slavery in all but name, and the natives were horribly mistreated. And I should repeatedly mention this, disease also very quickly wiped out lots of native groups as well. So the Spanish were terrible, and diseases were also terrible. The collapse of the Native American population led to debates amongst Spaniards about what to do about this crisis. A former encomiendero named Bartolome de las Casas weighed in on the side of the Native Americans. Here he is describing how the Spanish treated the natives. He wrote 2 books that are noteworthy for us. One on the destruction of the Indies, which, pretty spot on its title. And secondarily, In Defense of the Indian, in which Bartolome de las Casas argued that maybe Native Americans were people and we shouldn't be enslaving and killing them. On the other side of this argument was Sepulveda, who took a very Aristotelian view of different races of people having different places in society, and arguing that Native Americans were more or less subhuman and worthy of nothing but enslavement. In the end, de las Casas ended up convincing enough people that they did try to pass, that he was able to influence the king. Here's In Defense of the Indians. He was able to convince the king to pass the new laws of 1542, which made all Native Americans citizens of the Spanish Empire, which theoretically would prohibit slavery, would cut down on the encomiendas, and, of course, outrage the Spanish, who were really hoping to exploit native labor in order to become wealthy so they could get the heck out of the American continent and move back to Spain, where they really wanted to be. So, did the new laws work? Kind of. They did change the legal status of Native Americans in the empire, but they were very, very weakly enforced. And in general, the king would back down, and the system of repartimiento would replace encomienda, in which rather than using one village of Native Americans until you killed all of them, they would take small groups of Native Americans from a lot of different villages and then work them to death, and then theoretically go back to that village later once the population had somewhat recovered. So they would have a constant supply of Native Americans to work to death. I don't think you could make the case that this system was better, but it was different, kind of. I mean, honestly, not really. Life in the Spanish colonies was brutal for Native Americans, especially if you worked near the silver mines, because silver had to be purified with mercury, and so the life expectancy in those silver mines was incredibly low. So here's the population of Native American population of Mexico through a combination of disease, overwork, and mercury poisoning. Dropped from somewhere around 25 million down to about 1.5 million. So that's pretty rough. Historians disagree on the absolute numbers, but if you're quibbling about whether 100 million people died or just 23 million people died, I think your priorities might not be in exactly the right place. So yeah, not great. Here was a display that I found in the on the Turks and Caicos Islands, showing a timeline of Native American population on this island, and it didn't take that long until the entire population of the Caribbean was wiped out. So, with all the Native Americans in the Caribbean wiped out, now all of a sudden you still need labor, which brings us to African slavery and the triangle trade. Enslaved Africans were captured along the slave coast here in Western Africa, and then shipped across the Atlantic to be worked to death on these sugar plantations and in these mines. Uh, the system of African slavery is utterly despicable, and we're still dealing with the consequences of it to this day. So here's your triangle trade. We'll talk more about this when we get to the North American colonies, but yeah, not great. The other organization that the Spanish had was the mission system, which we briefly talked about when we mentioned Coronado an episode ago. The missions were established throughout the Southwest here, mostly in California and Texas, although there were a couple in Florida. The goal of these missions, again, was to teach the Native Americans about Christianity and, maybe get them to work for you a little bit. The reality was the Native Americans were worked much more harshly than was intended, and the missions caused significant amounts of problems, especially in the areas where they demanded that the natives build fortifications, build towns, abandon traditional religions, things like that. The Pueblo Revolt was one of the largest pushbacks against this mission system. In the Pueblo Revolt, so the Pueblo Revolt happened in sort of a New Mexico, Texas area. And the Native American groups for a long time had been just incorporating Christian beliefs into their existing pantheon of gods. And once the Franciscan monks discovered this, they decided that that was no longer acceptable, and they tried to stamp out native religion, which kicked off a massive revolt. And a guy named Don Juan Oñate came in and put the revolt down, and then chopped off all the feet of the people who revolted. It's created a larger movement by a guy named Pope, who was trying to unite the Native American tribes through a sense of a shared religious continuity and shared history. He's one of a number of charismatic Native leaders who will use traditional Native American religion and beliefs to try to unite separate tribes. Because one of the reasons that Native Americans really struggled to push back against European encroachment is because a lot of the tribes were more interested in sort of their traditional conflicts with their neighboring tribes than they were about these new invaders, and saw maybe the Europeans as a way to get a leg up on their neighboring tribes, not realizing that the Europeans coming in meant the absolute destruction of their way of life. So Pope organizes a revolt, passing secret messages through corded knots, sort of in the old Inca tradition. And they managed to burn and kill the populations of 7 or 8 missions, and drive the Spanish temporarily out of New Mexico. And so eventually the revolt is put down by Spanish soldiers. They send an army up to northern Mexico in order to crush the revolt. But what it convinces the viceroy of New Spain is that maybe these missions aren't worth the time. If we have to actually have a standing army, which of course are super expensive, in northern Mexico where there's nothing of economic value, then maybe we should just scale back these missions. And so the result of the Pueblo Revolt was a brief scale back of Spanish activity, in their northern colonies, but slowly the missions would return. So Pueblo Revolt temporarily successful. Oñate, ironically, has a statue in New Mexico for some reason, and Native American activists cut off the foot of the statue in protest several years ago, which I found hilarious. So the effects of the Pueblo Revolt are somewhat still being felt in the Southwest amongst Native American activists who argue that maybe we shouldn't have statues of people who cut off the feet of Native warriors in retribution for trying to protect their land. But I'll let you guys decide that. So take a moment, pause, make sure you can thoroughly answer these questions, and we'll see you next time when a series of other Europeans are going to come up, and we're going to be telling some stories and ruining some stories that you've known since childhood.